According to Linda Hughes, a worker at the National Hobo Museum in Britt, Iowa, history repeats itself. In times of war and economic crisis, the hobo population increases greatly. Circumstances started changing, prices started dropping, and debts started rising. There was a major banking crisis, serious policy mistakes of the Federal Reserve Board, and with the stock market crash in October 1929, the country was thrown into the Great Depression. Businesses were forced to lay off city workers by the minute, and when homeowners were unable to pay taxes or mortgages, they lost their property. With no other choice, many squeezed in with their relatives, but hundreds of thousands were not so fortunate. Some defied eviction, staying where they were. Others found refuge in one of the increasing number of vacant buildings. More found shelters under bridges, in culverts, empty water mains, or on vacant public lands, where they built crude shacks. As many people used whatever means as they had in their disposal for survival, they blamed Hoover for the downfall of the economic stability and lack of government help. These teeming communities of makeshift shacks known as Hoovervilles were often concentrated in the cities close up to soup kitchens run by. The shelters themselves varied widely, from stone houses and fairly solid structures built by those with construction skills to those that were thrown together with wood crates, cardboard, tar paper, scraps of cloth and metal, and various other discarded materials. Within their shelters, most people had a small stove, a few cooking implements, and some bedding, and little else. The farmers in the Southwest needed to escape the Dust Bowl. To protect themselves from the dust-filled air outside, they had to cover their eyes and noses. During the night, the wind would sound carrying dust through holes in the cloth wedged doors and windows. In the morning, there would be a thin layer of dust on tables and chairs near the windows or doors where dust had seeped in through the small crevices of the house, while the finest dust left in the wind. There would be dust on the crops, the fence posts, the wires, the roofs, the weeds, and even the trees. It continuously ruined the crops that farmers had to grow. Their methods were rendered useless against the dust storms, and as a result, farmers were forced to migrate to look for jobs elsewhere. Most of these farmers were called Okies or Arkies because of their Oklahoma and Arkansas accents, as they traveled along the railroads looking for work. While the Dust Bowl hurt the farming population, the Depression affected people in the city, forcing businesses to lay off workers by the minute and farmers to move away from the rural parts of the country. President Herbert Hoover, who was president until 1933, believed that self-reliance and self-help, not government intervention, was the best means to meet citizens' needs and maintain the voluntarism and individual effort would solve the country's economic woes. For example, newspapers used as blankets were called Hoover blankets, rubber soles of shoes replaced with cardboard were called Hoover leather, and fuel-dependent cars pulled by horses were called Hoover wagons. During the next presidential election, hobos and other Americans created a political statement by letting empty pants pockets hang inside out, calling them Hoover flags, while they simultaneously carried signs and posters saying, "This is life in Hoover days."
Roosevelt carried out his radio address, The Forgotten Man, that approximately one-half of the United States population, 50 or 60 million people, earn their living by farming or in small towns whose existence immediately depends on farms. They have today lost their purchasing power. There were many migratory workers and new technologies to take over jobs, leaving Americans to fight for their jobs. Historian Kenneth Alsop stated, "The mechanical mower, the reaper, the gang plow, the hay loader, fewer and fewer American hands were needed for the elaborate machinery rolling fast across the plains. Overall, there were too many workers and not enough jobs, forcing people to slip into the rank of a hobo. However, some people heard and fantasized the luxury of freedom from society. A slogan created by hobos, coast to coast on a piece of toast, promoted the idea of hoboism, to see the country and forget about the economic worries. According to a hobo, a lifestyle and culture so sweet, so addictive, so seductive, so intoxicating that those of us who retire after 20, 30, even 40 years of are never really free of it, because Lady Freeman has gotten too far in our blood to be gotten rid of her completely. Freedom, complete freedom, and the ability to pursue that ultimate free life, and the vehicle to propel you on such a quest, and a constitutionally based right to freedom, is truly a drug, a greasy, steely drug that once it sets in your blood, it's there for good." And no matter how you've retired, no matter how much you deny it, you'll never be free of it. Whenever you hear a train whistle, whenever you see a moving train, or just train cars, or even train tracks, that longing in your heart will tug at you so tight you'll realize that you're addicted for life. Hobo life was not always sweet, carefree, and perfect. Hoovervilles were built and scattered all across America, created with cardboard, glass, and sometimes furniture that families could carry after being evicted from their homes. In July 1931, a judge suspended the sentences of 22 unemployed men sleeping in Central Park, apparently in various locations, and gave each one $2 out of his own pocket. The shanty towns were often unsanitary and posed health risks. Illnesses such as tuberculosis and typhoid were common for the inhabitants of the shanty towns. Joan M. Cruz, a sociologist during the Depression, described, there was an especially high proportion of rickets, scurvy, and pellagra, which were due to dietary deficiency, and a significant incidence of epidemic disease such as tuberculosis, gonorrhea, syphilis, and malaria. Some shanty towns that included thousands of people created councils and even established their own presidents. One time where this occurred was Seattle, Washington. They created the National Unemployment Council and petitioned to the Seattle City Council for a community bath house to help solve sanitary conditions. In response, the Seattle City Council released a statement that, from a sanitary point of view, Hooverville is all wrong and should be entirely eliminated. In the film Hallelujah, I'm a Bum, the hobo is depicted as something of a buffoon. The characters of a Weary Willie, Happy Hooligan, and Tired Tim are typical of this characterization. Kenneth Alsop, in examining these characters, stated that they present the hobo as a harmless, daffy, ne'er-do-well whom the sedentary could laugh at and feel comfortably superior to. The series of tramp films made in the first half of the 20th century, starring Charlie Chaplin, presented a somewhat amusing and buffoon-like view of the tramp. Heartwarming and comical, yet mischievous, the tramp was shown in various circumstances.
In the song Dust Bowl Refugee, Guthrie captured the spirit of the hobo with the lyrics, yes, we ramble and we roam, the highway that's our home. Yes, we wander and we work, in your crops and in your fruit. And I wonder, will I always be a Dust Bowl refugee? Hobos would often sleep in train cars or in ditches, but most hobos made encampments called jungles. The jungles were hidden in glens or strands of trees from railroad tracks near a water source. Jungles would often have signs only decipherable to other hobos. Hobos survived by eating and drinking anything they could get their hands on. Food is acquired either through the meager amounts of money hobos gained through the work they could find scavenging, or through the generosity of others such as the priest. A well-known dish of the hobo jungle was mulligan stew. Mulligan stew consisted of food scraps as well as shoe heels and cowhide with a few chips of birch thrown in for seasoning. The unusual edible choices show how food for hobos were eaten solely out of survival and not for pleasure. Hobos often hitchhiked from town to town in search of jobs, but they are more famously recognized for riding the rails in boxcars. Because steam engines frequently had to stop and refill their boilers at trackside water tanks, hobo jungles were made beside those tanks as a source of water. This gave them easy access on and off the boxcars. Some hobos would even board moving trains. According to Luther S. Head, to be a hobo, you had to know how to get on a train while it's moving. Some hobos got killed by trying to get on trains that were moving too fast. Risks were taken to ensure employment at another town to stay fed and alive. Hobos would sometimes be hoisted up onto the boxcar by someone else. Experienced hobos would teach novices which engines hitched up boxcars and how to catch a train on the fly without getting injured. When there were no empty boxcars, hobos rode on the top of train cars. Although respected by other hard workers, it was rare for a hobo to find generosity. They were looked down upon by higher members of society and were often mistaken for tramps and bums. To fend off against ostracization and law enforcement, hobos created the Hobo Code, a set of signs for other hobos. For example, if a hobo met a kind-hearted lady, a symbol of a cat would be drawn near her home. If the woman spared money to the hobo as well, the hobo would inscribe 3 circles symbolizing that one may get money here.
Female hobos were often targeted because of their sex by male predators, railroad workers, and other hobos alike. Some women dressed up and acted like males to ward off sexual advantages. On the other hand, some women would use their sex as an advantage. As a woman, to survive, it was all part of the fine game of sexual politics. Hobos have a code of ethics stating that members not abuse handouts, to respect nature, and whenever possible to find work stay clean. Some better known hobos were poets, artists, and dreamers, who would engrave cameos on nickels, made models with matchsticks, and carved intricate designs on cigar boxes. No matter what they were thought to be, hobos followed the code of ethics that hobos be respectable towards nature, children, the police, and citizens. It also tells them not to belittle themselves for being hobos because there are others out there who may be worse off than them, or those who need their help. A private organization composed of social workers, sociologists, and citizens called the National Committee on Care for Transient and Homeless got together to provide and research statistics of growing populations of the homeless. They took surveys and found that the total number of homeless was estimated to be 1.2 million, of whom about half were thought to be transient. The NCCTH presented the statistics and findings to Congress to push the help of unemployed and homeless. According to Ellen C. Potter, the chair of NCCTH and director of Transient Program, warned, "If we do not handle the situation very wisely and constructively, we run into the risk of developing a nomadic tribe, irresponsible in its habits of life, subsisting ultimately as parasites upon society, and potentially a dangerous group contaminated by chronic," portraying the hobo lifestyle as an infectious disease. Creating FIRA was essential to Roosevelt's 3 main goals: to employ more people, recover good economic status, and create social and economic reforms. Government officials created a new perception that hobos were a public nuisance. People should go back into the workforce, and defeating unemployment in America was necessary. Despite their infamous portrayal, hobos left a legacy that continues to generate a fascination and resonance with the minds of many Americans today.